We're live.
Good evening and welcome to the last panel of the day on this day of International Democracy Week. We have a great conversation ahead of us, brought to us by the European Partnership for Democracy and their partners. We're very happy to be with you. My name is Guillermo Beltrá. I work for the Open Society European Policy Institute, which is an advocacy office for the Open Society Foundations. And our work is to look at all implications of technology and how technology policy can improve our democracies, how to better protect fundamental rights. And there's not a more topical issue that we could be discussing these days than what is the impact of technology on democracy. And to discuss all of these issues, we have today a very distinguished panel of experts that I will introduce in a second. Before I do that, I wanted to share a few reflections. I think it's important to realize how technologies have become the operating systems of our democracies, the way we access information, the way we participate in elections, the way we interact with each other, we consume information. Media pluralism is increasingly intermediated by technology companies. All of these issues are changing our lives in such fundamental ways that getting a grip on how we govern technology is getting a grip on how we govern ourselves and how and the health of our democracies. You will see on Twitter that a coalition of about 50 civil society organizations has recently published a very detailed position paper sent to the European Commission on the European Democracy Action Plan on all of these issues. And on some of those issues, we're going to be zooming in today with our speakers. The idea is that each of our speakers is going to introduce some of the trends that they're seeing, the problems that they're seeing, the solutions they would like to see for a few minutes, each of them, and then we will move on to a more dynamic conversation amongst all of us. You can always participate. Please don't hesitate to send your questions on Twitter. We have a team that is watching the conversation there and will be feeding those questions over to us. So that's somewhere where technology should actually help us have a better conversation with you. So please do engage. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. We have the honor of having Mr. Danilo Turk, who's the former president of Slovenia and the current president of the Club de Madrid. Welcome, Mr. Turk. Good evening. We also have the honor of having Marietje Schaake, who is the current international director of policy at Stanford, and of course, a former MEP, and so very well known in this house. Welcome, Marietje. Good evening. And then we have Eliška Pirkova, who is a Europe policy analyst at Access Now, a global digital rights organization, and a specialist in a lot of the issues that we will be talking about today as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Krzysztof Izbecki from the Państwo Foundation in Poland. Welcome, Krzysztof. So without further ado, Mr. Turk, we will start with your opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and let me start by expressing our pleasure and honor to be part of this very interesting and important discussion on democracy and tech policy about what COVID-19 has taught us. Now, I would like to first of all express the sincere thanks of the Club de Madrid World Leadership Alliance, which is an organization of 110 former democratically elected presidents and prime ministers. We are very grateful for being part of this discussion, although obviously we are not technical experts. We are people with a certain degree of experience and committed to democracy. We see our club has been established about 2 decades ago, that at present democracies are undergoing important changes, and we can also notice the fact that in many places we see regression of the quality of democracy, something that should worry us. Therefore, it is with a sense of concern that we are joining this and other debates on democracy today. Now, the questions of digital transformation and democracy obviously are not new. They have been discussed for some time now. Last year in 2019, we had a discussion in Club de Madrid and produced a document, a call for action on this subject. And what I'm going to say today basically reflects discussions that we have had so far. And those discussions were already motivated by our concern for democracy at the current stage. Now, coming in this brief introduction to the core of the question as we see it, we see three basic dimensions of democratic lives that were transformed, that are being transformed for better or for worse by the digital revolution. The first is the impact of big data on fundamental human rights. I don't think I have to explain this in any detail. There are problems of privacy involved here, the fact that we leave behind a huge amount of information which is then used by digital and internet services, by companies, by big monopolies and governments in ways which citizens do not control or do not have any understanding of. But I would like to add also one additional problem here, that the digital technologies are also reducing the footprint of human judgment and raise the question of how does one control the dynamic of public discussion and political process. So the reduction of human judgment in this big picture is a question that needs to be discussed. It's inevitable. I'm not suggesting that it is good or bad, but it is there and it needs to be discussed. The second element that we see is the impact of digital technologies, new technologies in general, on what can be called the social contract. Obviously, we understand that there is no such a thing as a definitive social contract, but there has been until recently an understanding on social contract of sorts in the context of democratic society, sometimes described as liberal democracy, emphasizing what Isaiah Berlin, the great philosopher, would call negative freedom, and allowing space for democratic processes to guide societies towards the future. Now, in the current era, we see that there are many ways in which the determinants of social contracts are changing. And when we are talking about COVID-19, I just wish to make one example, and that is the fact that digital divide and its implications is very serious, especially when one talks about students in schools who have access to digital world and others that do not. So the divide among those young people who can use internet for the educational and training purposes and those that cannot is quite serious. We have to look at that and we have to think about it and find solutions. And third obvious area is the impact of technologies on public debate. We are all aware about fake news, the facts in which digital technologies and social media in particular are revolutionizing production, distribution, and consumption of information. So this is another third aspect of impact of new technologies on relations that define democratic processes today. Now, to conclude this brief introductory remark, I would like to say that these trends obviously are primarily seen today in their unfavorable aspect, but they can be turned into a more favorable direction for the future of democracy. And this is something which motivates a discussion like ours today. I would only like to emphasize one element in this context, and that is the question of the future regulatory functions in the whole area of new technologies, digital world, artificial intelligence, the future of internet. We all know that when internet was started decades ago, it was deliberately taken or perhaps not allowed to be part of multilateral lawmaking process. Now, freedom of internet, multi-stakeholder approach, soft approach to internet management, those were the key words at the time. Now we see the problems that come with this sort of an approach, and there are many people who are asking themselves, has the time come for stronger regulatory approach by states, by organizations such as European Union, and of course, globally by the United Nations? Now, I'd like to stop here. I'm very interested in hearing what our distinguished experts have to say, and I'll be happy to participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turk. Very, very interesting remarks and three very important areas: impact on fundamental rights, the social contract, and the public debate. Indeed, three very big things. I'll move us on to Marietje Schaake. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and I'm really happy to join you on a day of democracy. I think every day should be a day of democracy, and I think the angle of focusing on the role of technology is extremely urgent. Now, when we think about the intersection of democracy and technology, it's easy to look to topics like disinformation, which lead to new incidents every day and questions about the role of large social media platforms. Or we could think about the risk of hacking and other kinds of manipulation and interference into the technologies that are used for the democratic process, whether it's referenda or elections. Or we can think about the more positive side, which is, engaging more people in an interactive discussion about the future of society and their role in it, maybe reaching young people in new ways. It's often a point on agendas when the discussion is about technology and democracy. But I think increasingly all of the incidents that we see, or even the hopes that we put in the use of technologies for engaging citizens, are distracting from a bigger and very fundamental question, which is, with what legitimacy do private companies govern over some of the most powerful aspects of our societies? Building the architecture for information, governing the information and data flows over it, and essentially deciding over growing parts of our lives in a way that control and oversight and agency are really slipping between the fingers of democratically elected politicians. And I would like to focus today's discussion about that legitimacy question, and perhaps from the angle of COVID-19, which of course has exacerbated some of these power imbalance questions, because there was already a great dependency, a great power in the hands of essentially advertising companies, but also more broadly, those who are developing technological infrastructure, governing big databases for governments, etc. COVID-19 has made the dependence on technological means, connectivity, working online, working virtually, even greater. And we can look to the stock markets to understand what that power imbalance really means. Not that long ago, the combined market capitalization of US tech companies was larger than that of the entire European Union and the United Kingdom combined. And so money in this space also exacerbates the power imbalance, in the sense that we see intensification of lobbying on the part of tech companies, even the sponsoring of civil society organizations, and questions about where truly independent oversight and independent research can come from these days. And so going forward, even though it's one avenue of thinking to conclude, because of COVID-19, nobody can go without online video conferencing, their laptops, their phones, the services that allow us to continue to work, to see friends and loved ones, to be entertained and informed. But I think it also really puts in the spotlight the very question of legitimacy. And so on this day of democracy, I would say let's focus on that, and let's look at how the privatization of almost everything digital, and this goes far beyond social media and election integrity, but really on a foundational level, how the privatization of everything digital and the governance in the digital and data space in the hands of private companies really erodes the agency and the legitimacy question, and hopefully on that level something can be restored. I'm happy to also zoom in on the role of the EU, but maybe we can do that later. I'll just be brief by saying that I think there's too much complacency in the EU oftentimes when there's questions about technology and democracy, there's a lot of pride in the GDPR, and surely that was a step in the right direction, but it cannot possibly be the answer to all questions. And if we look at the power imbalance, we're in need of a much more structural and fundamental approach on the regulatory and on the democracy side as well. So that would be my plea on this day of democracy, to put democracy in the spotlight, and not to have too many hopes or expectations of what the technology will bring as a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was mentioned before, the lack of regulation was supposed to lead to democracy going viral and a liberalizing effect flooding the world. We now know that this is not automatic and that democracy needs defending. Democratic principles need the rule of law. And so I hope that those fundamental questions can be at the core of the discussion, and that we are not distracted by incident after incident, even if these incidents underline example by example, scandal by scandal, case by case, what it is we should be looking at. So happy to engage in a more interactive discussion, but this is something that truly keeps me up at night.
Thank you very much. Very interesting remarks as well. And I really like the question about what is the legitimacy of all these operators that are now, I use the sort of the metaphor of the operating system of our democracies. You said like the pillars, the architecture of our democratic systems. I would suggest that as when we finish the first round, we actually go back and zoom in into that question, if you all agree, because I think that's a very important one, and it encapsulates a lot of the sort of sub issues that we are all discussing. I also take note of the point on the promise of tech being a self-fulfilling prophecy. From my own sort of personal perspective, I've been shocked how much techno-solutionism there is in all of our sort of institutional system, especially in the light of COVID. So I would love to explore that as well with all of you. Let me first then move on to Eliška Pirkova to share a few reflections for a few minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And it's very great that we are actually also touching upon the issue of legitimacy and good quality lawmaking when it comes to regulation of online platforms, their activities and their impact on public discourse and democratic discourse. So I will first maybe summarize briefly what Access Now was actually doing since the beginning of the outbreak of global health crisis. And then I will have a specific look on more content governance related issues, so spread of disinformation, misinformation, and the protection of freedom of expression during these extraordinary times. So first of all, whether it's privacy or free expression or access to information or any other fundamental rights, they become even more essential during the times of crisis. Fundamental human rights continue to apply in special legal orders or periods of emergencies, and this has to be kept in mind because they can be restricted only when necessary in order to actually prevent and mitigate that risk that could be possibly caused by the crisis. And they cannot go actually beyond some specifically defined requirements for the times of emergencies. I started a little bit with the rather legal definition, but I think this is very important in order to set the tone for anything that comes next, because we saw many rather abusive and human rights abusive measures being adopted by states during these extraordinary times. Access Now published several reports and kept monitoring the situation during the global health crisis quite closely. Besides of our work on data protection and privacy, we were also very closely looking at how the health data of users and individuals are being collected and how they are actually being used during the public crisis. And we also monitored the situation around deployment of different tracing apps that were using geolocation in order to monitor how the virus spread in individual member states in the EU. As a consequence of our activities, we also published the reports where we provide the concrete list of recommendations where we specifically address the states, and those are available on our official website, and I will happily share those resources later on with everyone who is interested. Now, when it comes to freedom of expression and COVID-19 health crisis, we basically witnessed exactly the same alarming developments that we saw even before crisis, but maybe rather intensifying in its power and negative impact. We saw again hastily and short-sighted solutions being adopted that were supposed to tackle issues of disinformation and misinformation, which ultimately ended up doing exact opposite and endangering human rights even further. We saw the states providing quite inadequate access to information, and especially information during health crisis has a capacity to heal and keep people safe. And we also saw the standard adoptions of laws that overcriminalize speech and that contain vague terminology such as fake news that then ultimately leads to abuse of such laws and in order to illegitimately suppress the existing decent and critical voices in the country. And it was also interesting for us to observe further how actually the spread of online disinformation and misinformation can help to foment hate speech against certain underrepresented groups, reinforcing stereotypes and social stigmas. Now, I will go a little bit back to what was actually mentioned about the regulation and legitimacy, because once again, it became obvious that looking for the solutions that will be ultimately focusing on deletion and quick removal of illegal or potentially harmful user-generated content won't take us any further. Amplification of disinformation or misinformation through algorithmic curation that is developed by online platforms and especially by dominant online platforms, or also gatekeepers of fundamental rights, as we call them, lies in the core of this issue and lies in the core of business models of these companies. These actually emphasize the point that we've been making together with other civil societies about the importance of good quality lawmaking, as well as a creation of procedural safeguards such as transparency that will enable us to actually return the power and empowerment back to the user, and also the control over information they receive and impart on these online platforms. In the meantime, we also prepared and issued the set of policy recommendations that specifically tackle that. And we do fully understand that transparency on its own cannot actually provide miracle solutions, and it's no magical solution to these ongoing issues, but nevertheless, it is an essential part if we want to actually come up with good research-based and evidence-based policymaking. In that regard, we propose and would like to see a tiered approach to transparency, which will contain of minimal legal safeguards that will protect users' choice when they are on online platforms. That will also reinforce a user-centric transparency. So what I as a user should know whether about the automated measures that are all the time running in the background, what the data are being used, how I'm actually being profiled, why I see what I see in my news feeds. And this is of extra importance, especially when we discuss the spread of disinformation and misinformation that usually falls into the scope of so-called legal but harmful content, which is the term we also oppose due to its inherent vagueness. And finally, in order to start creating a research-based and evidence-based policymaking in this field, we strongly advocate for a meaningful data access framework. That means that will enable researchers, journalists, and other independent parties to actually obtain the data about what platforms are exactly doing with the user-generated content that is being shared in vast numbers on daily basis. And also to explore further how these societal phenomena really impact users' everyday lives, and especially the lives of users at risk. I also mentioned this part due to the fact that what we saw during COVID-19, due to the ongoing health crisis, many platforms were actually forced to rely on automated measures and content recognition technologies more than before. We underline the dangers that are actually stemming from the use of automated measures many times in our policy work. Just to summarize these very quickly, of course, automated measures are often context blind. That means they cannot properly assess the context and the intent of the user who actually shared that particular piece of content, and thus they often generate false negatives or false positives, which means in a more human language that they misidentify completely legitimate speech as something wrongful. And on the other hand, they might miss a content that can be potentially dangerous altogether. Due to this fact, we also very much underline the importance of preservance of restricted content on online platform, especially during the COVID-19 health crisis. These are important data and information that can be used by researchers later to understand better, and also to actually enable users to fight against decisions of platforms and apply their right to a fair trial and access to effective remedy in case they decide to challenge these decisions. It should be clearly understood by a user when the decision about them is being made by automated measures, and when there is a human kept in the loop, and when the final decision was actually made by a human. And we were advocating also for keeping that restricted content by platforms instead of permanently deleting it, also in other contexts, when the piece of content can actually serve as a proof of human rights abuse or human rights violations, especially in the areas where otherwise the independent investigation wouldn't be able to take place due to the lack of access. So just to underline my initial start of this intervention, all of those aspects became even more visible and more urgent during the COVID-19 health crisis. And I think it's very important to understand that there will be an aftermath to this crisis. And at the beginning, Guillermo, you used a very good term, health of our democracies. So I think that precisely during the global health crisis, all measures that the states are adopting, and so private actors determine at what state we will find democracies when this health crisis is over. And just to maybe connect it a little bit more, and that will be my final comment, to the ongoing, or not anymore ongoing, public consultations to the European Democratic Action Plan, as well as the DSA legislative package, because these two are and should be complementary in their joint policy goals that they will ultimately share. I think this is an extraordinary opportunity for the European Union and for the European Commission to finally establish procedural human rights safeguards and due diligence that will finally prioritize users, their fundamental rights, and put them to the center. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Eliška, for taking us through a level deeper into a lot of the complexities of these questions and showcasing the work that Access Now has been doing. Congrats on that. If I could summarize and link that to what we were discussing before, I would say the point is, sure, the internet cannot remain an unregulated space, but we need to be very careful how we actually regulate it, because there's plenty of experience that shows that doing it the wrong way can actually be infringing on the health of our democracy and worsening it. I would also encourage our viewers to check out the work that Access Now has been publishing throughout the COVID-19 crisis. They take a global role and compare what different regions have been doing, and I think that is very, very helpful. Finally, let's hear from Krzysztof for a few minutes, and then we can start picking up on some of the common themes that you're all talking about.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. Thank you so much to EPD for having me here. I'll be very brief, but also quite pessimistic, I think, for the beginning, although this is not my nature. I'll be more optimistic when it comes to technology and COVID-19 a bit later. But referring to the title of our meeting, which is Democracy and Tech Policy, what COVID-19 has taught us, I would say that on a large scale, nothing. And this is unfortunately not a huge surprise, because were you surprised that China were not releasing the data on the COVID-19, or they were also the first to introduce tracing apps? Or were you surprised that Orban restricted freedom of expression using COVID-19 excuse or connected with the fake news that was spreading? I mean, these are not a very new phenomenon, and this is in these terms of narrowing or limiting the democratic space in Europe and globally. Unfortunately, this is the phenomenon that we are observing for a quite long time. And the development of technology has maybe boosted, but it seems that sometimes we are forgetting that these undemocratic trends are visible, and we can feel them, and especially in some part of the world, including the Central and Eastern Europe, which I kind of representing for quite long time ago, and especially also in the technology context. We can say that more or less it also started after 9/11, when we had to choose between the human rights and national safety, and now it seems that this choice is even more serious for us as a society, is to have this choice between individual health and human rights. The COVID-19 was again in some of the cases, at least, it was an excuse to introduce the various restrictions on human rights, not only from the point of view of technology, but I think anyway, the technology is not a complete different phenomenon than the whole life of human being nowadays. It's an important part of that. So bringing the restrictions into human rights in general, it also means some of the restrictions in the digital rights field as well. The model of net capitalism was not created in the first months of 2020. These are the consequences, what Marietta Schake was saying, these are the consequences of the quite long-term situation. And I think what has changed in the last few months, actually, at least for the majority of us, that we moved into our laptops, taking most of our offline democratic activities and environment with us, and mostly, and that's again true, mostly to the places when there is no effective civic or governmental control. But also we, from the point of view of democracy and human rights, and this is an example that I did observe in Poland when we actually had elections or had a electoral campaign in the middle of the pandemic, so March and April this year. The electoral campaign was mostly done through the social media. So on the one hand, these are the issues that already other speaker touched upon concerning the transparency of platforms, the transparency of political ads. By the way, the great response and the statement by EPD and other groups that were delivered in connection with DSA consultations. But also there is a new phenomenon that those who are excluded are even more excluded because they are not competent in using technology. They don't want to use technology for some reasons as well. But when we had the situation of electoral campaign going actually only on social media, apart from other problems, we have seen that a lot of people, a lot of citizens had no chance to be the part of the electoral campaign and to follow what the politicians and the presidential, it was a presidential election, what the presidential candidates were saying. So the COVID-19 and the technology also brought, I think, more exclusion when it comes to the civic participation in the thing, and the same with the tracing apps. It's only another chapter in the huge book of mass surveillance without effective civic and judiciary control. And finishing the last sentence, and I hope I will tell you more about it, that these negative aspects are only important, but still the peak of an iceberg. And also, as representing the civic tech community, I do believe that there is not only evil underneath this surface, and in contrary, there are some good examples that we can see some ocean of goodness because of technology here. So I will stop here, and I will bring my thoughts and ideas a bit later into discussion. Thank you, Gaimo.
Thank you, Krzysztof. Very interesting remarks as well. And I like your point about the fact that COVID has taught us nothing, in the sense that many of the problems we are talking about today were already there. If anything, many of them are now worse. But also I take note about the importance of talking about the optimistic outlooks and the sort of projects on the ground that we should be paying attention to. Let me then maybe just go back and ask a few questions about some of the themes that you've all highlighted, and please engage openly in a conversation with each other. I will start with something that Mr. Turk said, because the call for action that the Club de Madrid and others have agreed on very rightly, in my view, and I think all of us will probably agree in this call, is that regulating big data and artificial intelligence should be centered on the person, on the individual, on be respective of fundamental rights. And I was curious to ask your views about what you think, how that conversation is going, and how it can be won. Because globally there is this ongoing conversation about don't regulate what you don't know, and innovation, and be careful not to get not to get too much into the details, and global competitiveness. There's a whole angle of Europe, the US, and China, who's going to win the so-called AI race, and so on. And in Europe specifically, I'm sure you're aware, their conversation has been mostly centered around ethics and other sort of non-binding policy approaches. And so I was curious, from your perspective, how do we win that political conversation? How do we win the narrative so that, at least in the EU, but hopefully also globally, AI is governed from, indeed, like you say, a fundamental rights perspective? And if Mr. Turk, you want to share a few thoughts first, and then please, any others who want to join on that question, please raise your hand.
Well, gladly. Well, I would like to approach this specific question from an angle which was proposed by Mariette Schaake earlier, when she asked, what is the source of legitimacy for the big tech companies to govern our lives, essentially? I mean, that I think is a critical question here. And it's an important question also for all discussions about regulation and everything that comes later. We have to have a certain degree of clarity here. And then let me give you just a quick sketch of what I mean. You see, I think that the answer to this legitimacy question has to do with the natural twins, the twins of liberal democracy and market economy. Now, when liberal democracy won in the late 80s, early 90s, it was a kind of end of history moment at which nobody questioned the fact that, you know, liberal democracy is our way to the future, and market economy will drive this process towards the future. Now, that I think was understandable, and I think many good things happened as a result, but I think the whole political world was inattentive to certain aspects of where does this process lead to. Now, market naturally leads to creation of monopolies, and we have seen new types of monopolies emerging. We see monopolies which are interested basically about monetizing their product. You know, the whole idea of social responsibility was relegated to a dustbin of history in certain ways. I was involved in discussions in some 20 years ago when some people spoke about the only social responsibility of a company is to make profit. That was the kind of spirit of the time, 2 decades ago or so, when internet was growing, when cyberspace was becoming richer, and when the whole artificial intelligence production was rising. And of course, one has to be very serious about these things. We are. I mean, I heard very serious comments already, but I would like to add a kind of a small funny element in our discussion. You see, like everybody else, I'm using various platforms, news feeds, and so forth. And I'm using news feed powered by Microsoft News. And every time I open it, I'm surprised that I see stories about Meghan and Harry. I don't know who decides that I should receive this story on a daily basis. I'm not interested in that story at all. And everything I do on the internet would demonstrate that I absolutely have no interest in that. Or the most elegant mansions of the richest Hollywood actors. I'm receiving this every time I open my news feed. Now, I'm saying, this is one of the funny consequences of monopolistic domination of cyberspace and so forth. While talking about cyberspace, and I have heard in your comments the notion that, of course, one of the concerns here is the growing competition or growing tension between United States and China over cyberspace and all that. You know, we have another process in the making, and that is fragmentation of cyberspace, which is going on for a while now, and which also, from a different angle, requires better regulation. So I think that whichever approach you take, legitimacy approach, a management approach, or kind of preservation of coherence of global cyberspace approach, whatever approach you take, you come back to the fundamental question of regulation. And here I think that Eliska Pirkova told us some very interesting things about this, and perhaps our discussion should develop them a little further. So what are the limits of regulation? What are the kind of red lines which we really have to be careful about while regulating, but not understand or not accept to an extent which was actually defeat the purpose of regulation? You know, we have always been so impressed and so careful about freedom of internet that we have kind of refused regulation a limine, you know, generally. So we have a problem which was not resolved. It has to do with legitimacy. It has to do with all other aspects that we are discussing, all the negative questions, the adverse effects, threats to digital environment and democracy. So to stop here, I would like to say, well, we always come back to the regulation. Let's see where the red lines are and whether we have stronger argument to make in favor of a legitimacy of regulatory process.
Thank you. I will, those are very interesting reflections. Indeed, the question of legitimacy moves us into the question of how can we ensure the democratic process to actually regulate the internet space can safeguard those democratic principles and fundamental rights that we want to. Let me ask Marice if you want to share some more thoughts on the legitimacy question, on anything that you're hearing, but also inserting now the angle into the conversation of what do you think the EU should do about it. If you have any concrete suggestions or ask from the institutions, former legislator like you were, you will have a lot of experience on how difficult it is to get there.
Yeah, sure. It's not easy, but not doing anything is not acceptable either. And I really encourage everybody to not put the potential risk of abuse in the way of moving ahead with regulation. And I think it's really time for civil society to also look in the mirror here, because there is, I would say, legitimacy for democratic governments to intervene. Now, that doesn't mean that any outcome is going to be a good one. First of all, there's different opinions in democracies, and there's a need to get to a majority in order to pass anything. And obviously, a commitment to universal human rights and making sure that there's not unintended consequences of any regulation is always important to keep in mind. But I feel like there has been a hesitance that has delayed the process of taking seriously of what the status quo was gradually leading to. In other words, by looking at what the risk could be of a failed or an unfavorable outcome of any type of regulation, I feel like the push has been too weak, and especially vis-a-vis well-paid, ever-growing numbers of lobbyists who have convinced Europeans that a regulatory intervention would stifle innovation. And the challenge is for European lawmakers, I think, to get to a place where they can intervene on the basis of democracy. I hear over and over again, you know, we need to be careful not to regulate the internet. It's not about regulating the internet. It's about regulating and ensuring that there is non-discrimination, you know, in the human rights sense. So not a different treatment on the basis of people's very personal characteristics. that there is a protection of the right to privacy, which we talk quite a bit about in Europe, but that there's also meaningful access to information as a precondition, enforcement of antitrust in new ways where it may be at stake, and things like that. You mentioned the need for deliberative public debate, for pluralist voices, and not just for those voices who can either pay their way up to the top or game their way up to the top to be heard. That way, the quote unquote marketplace of ideas kind of gets misunderstood, not in the sense of who is most convincing with their ideas and arguments, but rather who can pay the most or who can trick the most. And all of this, I think, illustrates how the public interest is at stake, but it's on a fundamental level that we have to look at it. So if I had any recommendation to the European Commission, and I think broadly the ideas are good, it would be to, one, turn them into legislative proposals and action sooner rather than later, to really step up the speed and the sense of urgency, especially as there's a lot of crisis issues now dominating the political agendas, not to have this sink to the bottom of the political agenda. So to keep going, to put the public interest first, and to also put democracy first in the legislative process, in the regulatory process. Again, this is not about regulating the internet. This is about safeguarding democracy. And perhaps looking at it that way, some of the concerns can easily fade to the background, because if this is about safeguarding democracy, then it includes respect for universal human rights. It is on the basis of the rule of law. There would be redress mechanisms in the case of unfair treatment. There would be independent oversight and independent research into some of these processes. So let's create a positive agenda for change and put democracy first. Then I think we will move this kind of stuck debate, to be honest, that has led to insufficient action, perhaps into a more action-oriented mode. And certainly that's what Europe needs. Because frankly, when I'm at Stanford or when I'm in other parts of the world participating in discussions about governing technology, then or governance of the digital world, then there's tons of discussions where Europe is not even mentioned. Not mentioned. And I hate to say that because I'm a proud European. It's not something that gives me any pleasure, but it's a reality that I recognize. And I think that Europeans also need to recognize. Just by claiming that a regulatory approach and a superpower in the regulatory field is the aim doesn't mean that it actually manifests itself in the real world. And we've seen plenty of examples coming from both the US and China recently that suggest that they could also be interested in setting the standards through regulation, even if it's a different type of regulation. So any wake-up call that can work, I think is welcome.
Thank you. This is a very interesting conversation, and I'm always hesitant to actually jump in with our own thoughts, but there I can only just wholeheartedly agree with the need for speed in this sense and the sense of urgency. And I think many of us know well how many sort of internet-related political conversations have been based in the past of, oh, we're going to break the internet, or, oh, there's not going to be any more innovation, whether it was on telecoms issues or whether it was on copyright issues or whether it was on other internet related issues. And the reality then turned out to be very different. So I totally hear you about the need, and I take that point as a member of civil society about the need for us to step up our game and make our push even harder, because it is time, I think, for the EU institutions to take a look at this, not just from a market perspective, but from a democracy perspective and a citizen's perspective, first and foremost. And that's what we're all, I think, trying to achieve. Sorry, I took my hat off of moderator for a second there. Is there, I know, Maricha, you need to run in a couple of minutes. Is there anything else that you would like to share before you do?
Not at this point. I think I've shared quite a bit, and I'm also very happy to hear other voices. So thank you for having me, and wishing you a great rest of the Day of Democracy, which I think we should celebrate and defend every day.
Thank you for being with us. Eliška, Krzysztof, on and all of the issues that we're discussing. Do you want to jump in? Eliška, do you want to go first? Please share some thoughts. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you so much. I absolutely agree with everything that has been said so far. And as a representative of civil society, I do think that we are trying our best to step up the game. The times that we would somehow advocate against any form of regulation of online platforms is long time gone. Quite the opposite. We've been actually working on a very as solid and as operational recommendations for European regulator as much as we could. We also participated on all public consultations that were actually published this summer by European Commission. And those who are the part of this space know that there were quite few. And it's very much our goal to actually have those minimum safeguards for users' fundamental rights, whether when it comes to the issue of user-generated content or the use of AI, even though in the context of content recognition technologies, I'm always very hesitant to use that term AI or artificial intelligence, but the use of automation or machine learning systems is definitely the part of it. However, we as a civil societies have also the role of holding the critical voice. And when we see the regulatory efforts that we know might have some positive aspects in them, but on the other hand, might also actually just reinforce the ongoing human rights violations, whether these are done by private actors or in some cases also by state actors, because state-sponsored propaganda or state-sponsored disinformation is also nothing new and definitely relevant for the European Union as well. It's precisely our role to step up and point out those shortcomings that can ultimately have just outreaching negative impact on online users. Having said that, we're definitely advocate for human rights centered and user-centric regulation of online platforms that will, as I mentioned before, put users' human rights in the core, and also establishes some due diligence requirements for those online platforms that have significant impact on public discourse and democracies that we see on a regular basis. I could probably elaborate further on those, but I will stop here and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. Krzysztof?
Sure. I think in general, of course, I agree. There's no big controversy between us, at least here on this Zoom. But also in the terms of regulation, I try to adapt it to the history of humankind in a way. And I not so long time ago, the labor rights or even women's rights were also considered by some people as the bottleneck of innovation. And there was a huge fight over hundreds of years actually to achieve the level of the labor protection as we have now. And as we can see, I mean, we may be not super happy with the economy, but it's definitely much better than it was in the times when we started to talk about regulating the labor market, for example. And of course, in the terms of using the automated decision-making processes of artificial intelligence, especially from my perspective, because this is what is interesting for the Państwo Foundation, from the perspective of the use in the government-citizens relations, they should be regulated as any other administrative process when the human rights, but also the rights and responsibilities of citizens are considered. In the terms of the internet platforms of social media, to also be more specific, that's of course they became a modern agora or even the monopolistic agora. So it does include all the things as freedom of expression, the pluralistic debate, etc. And at the same extent as we have constitutions, directive which are regulating and securing our rights of line, I don't see any reason, and I hope, and I do see that also European Commission is working on it, that we should also extend the similar guarantees, the similar legislation to online activism. But also, as the person who works a lot in Central and Eastern Europe, I have to say that it's not so easy when it comes to the global approach, of course, because we could ask the question whether we think that the Russian government or Chinese government should regulate as much as possible the internet platforms or any other kind. I mean, they are doing it so, and this is the great obstacle for democracy and for the debate. So that's, I think, one of the problems that we are facing, that, of course, in European Union, when we have more or less democratic states as members, that's a different discussion. We're using the regulation to protect our rights, while a lot of my colleagues active in Russia, they are afraid of being regulated, or even regulated, to name it openly, regulating a Facebook, because they would lose the last resort of the possibility to have a more pluralistic debate and to have their voice heard in the wide public.
Thank you. That's indeed a very important point as well about the unfortunate lack of health of some democracies in the EU that we need to be very aware of. So let me, with that, then maybe bridge to that other question that we wanted to explore today, which is, from all of these sort of tech policy questions, how do you think the EU is a complex machinery, as we all know, and regulating certain things at an EU level or at a national level will have different consequences, and there are many reasons why we would do one or the other. How do you all think we should approach these tech issues? What should the EU do itself, and what should be left to national member states? What is important to bear in mind when addressing this question as well? Does anybody want to start? Mr. Turk, please go ahead.
All right, I think the time is running, so we have to move to the next set of questions. But of course, with the advantage of having listened to the previous discussion, and I would like to try to do that. Now, obviously, one must not overlook some of the positive experiences that we have gained during the COVID-19 pandemic so far. Personally, I would like to say especially the epidemiological models that have been developed during the pandemic. Of course, we have been constrained in our freedom of movement, and we watched TV and followed other media very attentively. And I myself was impressed by the whole discussion about the epidemiological models as they have developed due to the technologies that exist, and they were used. I mean, they were used for a good purpose, and I think that they helped, at least during the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic, in particular in Europe, to be used actually quite effectively. Now, time will tell whether that was good enough or not, but I think that we should not overlook the positive side, which was clearly there, and helped policymakers, helped managing the health systems, and so forth. So there are positive things. There are things which are at least potentially positive now, and that is in the process of overcoming the economic recession, the whole question of social situation and so forth. We have now mobilization of resources, which is quite high, and especially in European Union. And again, the question of allocation of resources helped in developing policies that would be adequate to move the whole, development of European Union economies further towards green economy, digitalized economy, and so forth. Again, here the new technologies can be a great help in the development of appropriate policies. And my hope is that this will be the case. Now, of course, this is not directly related to communication technologies, but more to the analytical side and to the policy decision-making side. However, as Krzysztof Izdebski was saying, let us take advantage of the previous experience with, for example, labor regulation. Now, what does labor regulation mean today? Now, we have very wealthy experience in Europe, at least on that. We want that experience to be taken advantage of in the future. And I think we have really to be very careful in developing an appropriate approach, which, you know, in some aspects will be nation specific, in other aspects it will be community wide. Employment is becoming increasingly precarious everywhere, in every aspect. Now, we cannot change this technological development by making it rigid. So we have to figure out how to adjust the regulatory system to the technological realities and protect people in the process. That's a big challenge, but shouldn't be seen as impossible one because of the past experience and technological means which we have, which are better than ever before. So these are positive things. Also, empowerment of citizens. Here also we can do more. So, you know, there are positive things here. And of course, I don't know if I'm going to get another opportunity to talk about some of the questions that were raised in the previous discussion about how to approach the whole issue of legitimacy and human rights and this question. If you allow me, I would wait with that for later and prefer to listen to my colleagues on this positive side, because I'm sure that each of us has, you know, while being concerned, also sufficient attention to the positive things that we have seen in the past months. And let us identify them as much as we can, because that is also helpful.
Thank you. Of course, we can focus on that and then come back to the question that you want to share a few thoughts on. And I'll keep my question about the sort of the EU and national level maybe for later. Let's focus on what Mr. Turk was now sort of moved over to, which is what positive developments have you witnessed and what positive developments do you see in the horizon that tech will bring to democracy and to social participation in general? I would suggest we start with Krzysztof. You specifically mentioned that earlier. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Guillermo. In fact, I think that there were, as I was saying at the very beginning, like a lot of good things has happened, and especially I'm saying this from the perspective of the one of the biggest civic tech community globally, which is Code for All network. That is chapters of the Code for All networks are in Japan. Generally Asia, Pakistan, Africa, South and North America, and of course Europe. And the first impression that I got, but it was the first thought that the community of civic tech activists has, is like how we can help to prevent all the negative aspects of the COVID-19 in this sense. And also maybe I will elaborate more on this in the second round, or the next round, when it comes to the regulation, but also what happened with the regulation of open data within the European Union, but also globally, was very helpful in this regard, because we could use, as a civic tech community, we could use a lot of data to fulfill this obligation to the society as activists we do feel. And there was like different examples on that. One of the examples is the something called the lockdown, the project lockdown, which actually tracks all the limitations of human rights and democratic principles all over the world. So this would not be possible if not the data and the very easy way to collect the data now. The same goes with all the issues that actually states were not able to fulfill it, also because they have other obligations, but when it comes to the providing information to citizens. So again, the data, and we as the intermediary of the being intermediary of the the government and the society in the way. So for example, there was a Romanian app that was collecting all the data from the European countries on different aspects of lockdowns, whether you can cross the border or not. It was very helpful to the people who were looking for such an information. And of course, the huge part of this was also connected with preventing the fake news concerning the COVID-19, the huge projects in Africa, but also in Europe and other regions were being able to to elaborate in a very speedy way on some technological tools. We were able to, at least to some extent, to bring up some credible information to the discussion, but also because there were like number of problems arising from the lockdown, for example, that I think most of us have never thought about it, including the increase of domestic violence when the people were shut down at homes, which is of course a very important problem in society, but it was really even bigger during the times of lockdown. And also a lot of tools were created to at least to try to support the victims or the potential victims of the lockdown, bringing them the possibility of the secure communication, etc. So basically, these are the good opportunities. On the other hand, I have to also tell about my reflection on some negative aspects, which I think are quite justified, maybe from the side of civic tech or not, I don't know, confront me. But we were acting really fast, which was needed at that time. But maybe sometime we were not sufficiently thinking about respecting privacy, respecting other things or other unexpected consequences of some of the tools. While, and now I'm coming back maybe to this track of discussing the regulation, we shouldn't use it as a good example when it comes to the technology which are implemented by governments or which are being created or are with us all the time as internet platforms. For example, we need to do the algorithmic impact assessments. We need to be more focused on checking how technology is securing or guaranteeing the personal data protection or other human rights and anti-discrimination, because that's another whole big issue when it comes to the potential boost of the new problems we can all share. But still, there's a good energy within the people who are technologists, who are activists, to use the technology for good. And I'm happy also that I could share some examples, because let's be more tech realistic, not only tech pessimistic, or definitely not too much tech optimistic in the way.
Thanks a lot for that very good list. I hope that good energy continues. And actually, I think one important question, which we haven't discussed today, is how can we actually do regulation in a way in which it encourages and facilitates the work of civic tech organizations to develop all of those positive projects and applications using tech. And I completely understand that. I'm sure it's not always easy to plan for all the unexpected consequences, but thanks for all your work. Sorry,
can I just add on that, on your question, how it's like, it's not easy to regulate it, of course, but also one thought. I mean, from this point of view of civil society organization, and also we do live and are being active because of the grants we're receiving, and think also this is one of the policy recommendation we gave to the European Commission already more than a year ago, that when it comes to the grant schemes, they should be more open for more agile approach and more concentrated on building the environment than the actual project. Because if you have a good environment, then in the situation as COVID-19 or any other disaster, that we can build faster and better and directly respond to the problem, while when we are being paid or granted for the projects, sometimes you're writing the proposal in 2018 and then you have to think about some metrics, etc., and then boom, February, March 2020, you see nothing is really important from this, and it doesn't bring a change. So also like supporting financially also the environment for civic tech, this would be my repeated recommendation also for European Commission.
Point very well taken. Thanks a lot. And Eliška, I know, do you have any other, well, sorry, before I forget, if anybody in the audience would like to have more information about the different projects that Krzysztof has been talking about, please don't hesitate to ask on Twitter. I'm sure we can point you into some more details. And Eliška, over to you to see if you have other similar examples of good practices, also in terms of how to regulate. I know you guys also track globally what are good and not so good approaches on how to regulate some of these things. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So in terms of good practices that we observed in our work during the COVID-19 health crisis, we specifically actually looked for them when we were preparing our reports, and we titled those the promising practices. And unfortunately, I have to admit that they were not easy to find. And we were specifically focusing on how the states actually respond to the crisis and what is that regulatory effort to handle the crisis in that regard. However, there were few, and we were very happily surprised that when we found few countries that, for instance, decided against the use of geolocation or tracking and instead opted for detailed in-person contact tracing, which is the method that, if it's accompanied with testing at scale to really identify infected people, it actually is the most effective one so far, and also it then diminishes any further risk to the right to privacy and data protection of individuals. And it accurately maps the actual spread of the virus. In terms of disinformation and misinformation, where we also published a separate report, especially in the context of online hate speech, one of the best promising practices that we identified was actually the one launched in Barcelona, where Barcelona took the online hate speech, and especially the one that actually had a racist connotation, quite seriously, and started social media campaign using the hashtag #StopRacism. And the campaign highlighted the story of 6 activists who actually, in the context of COVID-19 health crisis, share their views on how actually racism and xenophobia escalated during this period. We also provided some good examples for some countries that actually provided the adequate access to information. And as I said during my initial intervention, access to information during the global health crisis is absolutely essential for protection of public health and the well-being of individuals. When it comes to positive example for a regulation, and you can imagine that those are quite difficult to find as well. But I would maybe go back to the argument that Krzysztof actually mentioned about the auditing of algorithms and other kind of obligations, or how to actually oversight and enforce those future obligations that we hope will be reflected in Digital Services Act. And those positive examples, even though if they are not directly being currently implemented by any national law or state law, or they are to some extent, and let me maybe elaborate a little bit further. So even those national regulatory efforts, whether they are being adopted and created by member states, or whether these are the countries outside of the European Union, very often we find very positive aspects in them. It's just the other very relevant provisions that can actually reverse the whole direction that the law might have taken and violate the rights of online users even further. But for instance, in terms of transparency requirements, we saw significant progress at the national level and in the lawmaking of member states, that they do listen to criticism and they try to actually switch that focus on pure quantity of removed user-generated content to rather quality and to better understand what is actually happening on these platforms. We also see a lot of positive efforts and developments in terms of notice and action procedure. And now I know that this is getting a little bit niche for the topic of the content governance, but basically those reporting and adequate response mechanisms to illegal content online. So while we criticize many of these regulatory efforts, we also do see a progress in research, more informed policymakers, and policymakers who are trying to take these opinions on board and look for the ways how to actually incorporate them into the regulatory framework. We also mainly have a very positive experience with working with the European Commission on the upcoming Digital Services Act. And I think that there is certain level of shift in policymaking to actually focus on the fundamental rights and reinforcement of fundamental rights while tackling these market dominance of large online platform that now has an enormous amount of power in their hands, which is unprecedented in the history. So in terms of, if I should give you one positive example, it would definitely still be Marco Civil in Brazil, for instance, for various reasons, for different safeguards and measures that the law actually contains. Now, the implementation and enforcement of the law is another topic, but there are many resources for positive inspiration for European regulator. And we also try to actually summarize those in our policy recommendations. Algorithmic auditing or human rights impact assessment or risk assessments for different measures that the platforms deploy is definitely the part of it. But I also think that this directly then touches upon the issue of how we will enforce these laws, what will be that oversight mechanisms, and how we are going to learn from our past previous mistakes or the gaps in different regulatory systems that already somehow regulate online space and use those lessons for a better enforcement mechanisms and functioning law, because we might have a perfect law on paper, but if there are not enough enforcement behind it, then we will fall into the same trap again.
Thank you. Very important points as well. And I take good note, and I hope important people at the European Commission are watching, because I think you make a very important point about the fact that now that we're going to regulate a lot of these things at the European level, there are already a lot of examples around the world from which we can learn both good things and as well all the bad things, all of the risky things that we're already seeing are infringe on human rights, and not to repeat the same mistakes. We have about 10-15 minutes to go. I wanted to go back to you, Mr. Turk. You mentioned that you had some other thoughts to talk about this question of legitimacy and human rights. And I would link that now to another very important point that Eliška just made, which is the question of how do we enforce these laws? Because we've been talking about, should we regulate? What are the red lines? How do we build that regulation and so on? But a complete separate question is, how do we actually enforce those laws? And there are already many laws that relate to the internet and to the digital space in Europe, and they don't get enforced for a myriad of reasons. I would be very keen to hear all of your thoughts on how we improve that sort of architecture in Europe. Mr. Turk, if you want to start.
Yeah, well, before coming to the question of enforcement, I'd like to have a few further comments on the question of legitimacy and democracy. See, because this, I think, has to be discussed further. We have to fully understand the complexity and the depth of this question. And one aspect of this does not have to do so much with new technologies, with artificial intelligence, internet, or any of these wonderful things of our era. It's actually quite old. And that thing is that democracies are complacent, and democracies are slow in responding to big new challenges. Now, they are quite effective eventually, but they are very slow in the process. And you will find a lot of commentary explaining what one of the British theoreticians, David Runciman, once defined as the confidence trap. Democracies are so self-confident that they think that, democratically, you will eventually work it out one way or another. Now, this is a problem for political leaders. It's a problem for civil society. This is a problem for people dealing with technical issues, and it's a problem for regulators. Now, there are various ways and complementary ways in which this problem can be approached. I am not a technical person, so I don't claim to have any brilliant idea in that regard. But there are some ideas which were mentioned earlier in our discussion, which I think have to be explored further. First is the concept of non-discrimination as a central concept of human rights. See, human rights in general is again a very general and beautiful idea, but you have to kind of disaggregate it a little bit and see the core. I mean, the core is non-discrimination. You have to make sure that the regulation as it evolves helps those disadvantaged. Now, human rights are for those who need human rights. There are small elites which actually don't need human rights. I mean, they are powerful, they are wealthy, and they can handle their things very easily. But human rights are for those who need human rights. And here is what where non-discrimination makes a big difference, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable group like children. I mean, now with the way the educational systems are evolving, I think the regulators have to be particularly attentive to ensure equality of opportunity for children in developing skills, developing access to technology, developing many things. And this has to do with non-discrimination, leaving no one behind, and so forth. Now, I realize these are fairly general concepts which are not easily translatable into specific regulation and enforcement, but they are necessary. And I think we need further and deep thinking and discussion to understand the links and also to figure out then norms and enforcement. Now, another aspect which is again not about regulation and content of norms and enforcement mechanism, but is very important overall, is the question of agenda setting, which may perhaps on the first glance not have much to do with new technologies, artificial intelligence, internet, and the rest. European Union has declared its commitment to what is called European Green Deal. Now, this has been put on kind of a back burner during the COVID pandemic. I mean, we haven't heard very much about that in the past months, but this has to come back into the center of political agenda in European Union, not only for its inherent importance. It has to come back both for its inherent importance, but also for its importance for the civil society. I think that there is much more sensitivity to the question, to the need to move in the direction of European Green Deal in the civil society than is reflected in the area of policy making, regulation, and enforcement. So I think it's really very important that the agenda of European Union is properly structured and that it includes those priorities which were critical for mobilization of civil society. And this is not primarily about regulation or enforcement. This is about agenda. And the agenda has to be really civil society friendly. That will address also the question of legitimacy and will help us to then develop appropriate regulation and appropriate enforcement. Just one tiny example in this regard. I mean, on European Green Deal, will the financial institutions of European Union be in line with that vision? Will they provide credit for projects which are helping European Green Deal, or also to projects which are not helping the European Green Deal? And then obviously, how do we know what's going on? How can we use the whole information systems to understand what is really going on? Is the European Bank on Reconstruction and Development following a kind of a credit policy which is really geared towards what the civil society wants or not? Again, we have an agenda issue, we have a policy issue, and one when civil society can and should be mobilized. Again, this is not about regulation per se and not about enforcement. And here, and when it comes to enforcement and regulation, I would like to simply say, well, you know, European Union regulatory process is complex and alien to people. I mean, people have really big difficulties in following it. So it has to be brought closer to the people. And how to do it again, the information technologies can perhaps help us by identifying priorities, And that also then helps us to identify and define the enforcement mechanisms. Right now, in the discussion on the European Recovery Fund, we hear a lot of discussion about rule of law, how rule of law has to be incorporated in the recovery process. Well, then this is going to be a big challenge, both in terms of regulation and enforcement. So we see we have really a very fundamental and difficult question to deal with. We are not going to be able to deal with it purely in terms of norms and mechanisms of enforcement. So we have to apply other things. The right choice of principles to be followed, the right policy priorities, the right focus on institutions such as financial institutions, and also helping the civil society to develop its voice. The voice of civil society has to be heard. So this is where I am. I mean, I cannot go further. See, I'm a professor of international law by basic orientation, and I would like to offer something like more, you know, a treaty which resolves all this. But I don't think that there is such a solution right now. It may come later, but right now I don't see it.
Thanks a lot for all those reflections. Also very helpful to see the bigger picture and taking us to an even higher level. I take good note of your point on agenda setting, and it is true that as a member of civil society for the past decade or so in Europe, I think one of the biggest concerns I would have is the imbalance of power in terms of agenda setting and access to actually policymakers between the corporate sector and civil society generally. So anything we can do to address that imbalance of power, I think will be very helpful in creating a more sort of democratic and civil society focused process. We just have a few minutes left, and I want to move over to both of you, Eliška and Krzysztof, for some of your thoughts on all of these conversations. But we've actually had a question from the audience that I wanted to ask you all, because it relates to some of the things that we're talking about, and specifically on the question of enforcement, I think. And I read out the question. It says, "Hi all, this is Benjamin Lancer, City Councillor for the Christian Democrats in the Netherlands. I have a question about effectiveness. How are we actually going to implement these rules? Many parties want to implement them, but it takes a long time. How can we arrange this in the short term?" So I think that takes us back as well as how do we put what we have on paper actually over into reality. And I'll let you maybe have a few comments. We'll go around the virtual room. Also, if you want to close off, as we have just a few minutes left, who would like to start?
I can start, and I would just, of course, we're talking about like a very diverse environment. From my perspective, there's a lot of these diverse aspects, but for me, there's also a difference, and the difference on the level of how difficult it is to regulate it from the perspective of the private sector. So let's call it internet platforms for this debate as an example, and the public sector, which is more of the concern for me and the mission of my foundation. I think when it comes to this private sector and regulating internet platforms, one of the most effective tools that we can have when it comes to the enforcement is connected with the expression that money talks. So competition law rules. I mean, this is what Commission has tried many times, more or less effectively. But my impression also as viewing it from distance is that this is something that the big internet companies might be afraid of, actually. So that's the point of an internet platforms, or in general the private sector internet or technological services. When it comes to the public sector, I think this is also connected with the quite easy tools, I think. I mean, unless you really want to regulate it. And also an AI a white paper, the AI strategy of European Commission is pretty good in this regard, although it could be more specific. But one of the proposals is introducing the obligatory algorithmic impact assessment only for these high risks tools, but still those who are implemented in the public sector. So basically, this is having this algorithmic impact assessments is also the good thing when it comes to the enforcing. But also the problem that we have encountered in a lot of our research, that the government has no information what kind of automated decision-making processes are in place. So it is connected with the broader problem of the public administration. So working in silos, basically. So this is, I think, what we should do to enforce also the laws or regulations or technology is also to think about the actual reform of the administration as such. In this regard, because working in silos, I think it's not possible anymore, especially with the technological revolution. So it's a short comment now. I know we have not a lot of time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Eliska.
Thank you very much. And first of all, before I will touch upon the issue of effective enforcement, I just would like to say thank you to Professor Turk for his great remarks. As a member of civil society, I definitely appreciate them. And going back to the enforcement mechanism, whatever regulation is coming our way, it's going to have a massive scope. That's something we all already understand and are aware of. The competition tool aspect, which was also the part of the public consultation issued by the Commission, is extremely relevant. So I'm definitely seconding that comment of Krzysztof. And it might be actually the one that will truly impose that significant pressure on these online gatekeepers. And also we saw that enforcement mechanism exercised from the angle of competition usually works very well. And one of those, even if we say that we have to learn from the previous mistakes, we should also keep in mind those positive lessons that we already have under our belt. Now, we do have, of course, some concrete ideas about some enforcement mechanism, but I think that the part of the question was how to make it effective and fast. Well, I'm not quite sure what would be that fast time frame there, because we just started with legislative efforts. We still haven't seen the exact proposal. It should be coming our way by the end of this year, and then we will be much smarter. But of course, due to the large scope of the upcoming regulation, we will need to find a way how to actually engage independent national regulators and from various sectors that these regulation will be touching upon. And with that, and that's a probably big ask and big emphasis for the Commission and national member states, these bodies will need to be equipped, whether at the European level or whether at the national level, they will need to be equipped with sufficient resources and capacities. Now, there are many question marks about that. There are issues of independency of certain national bodies, and we will need to wrap our head around that. But there is also the contextual nature of many issues that DSA will be touching upon, and it is quite difficult to imagine how that could be actually strictly and coordinated just from Brussels in a centralized manner. So these resolution between centralized versus decentralized models of enforcement when it comes to platform regulation will be a huge challenge. Now, we already saw what happened with the enforcement of GDPR. Access Now also publishes the report on the enforcement of GDPR every year. Again, I can share the resources later on. And we know that often it's the lack of capacity and resources for whether those are data protection authorities or European bodies responsible for enforcement of GDPR, why the effective enforcement of the regulation is actually failing. And then we need to be very smart about what type of competencies we invest in what bodies. This will be all difficult topics to come up with, but we remain positive. We have the idea of sort of a hybrid model for the enforcement of the future regulation. And also we need a coordination body at the European level, but with significant capacities and competencies in their hands, so they can perhaps enforce some level of consequences for those member states who do not keep their national regulators independent, as they should, according to the rule of law and democratic establishment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very clear asks and thoughts to both of you. Mr. Turk, is there anything from your side that you would like to add on these final questions?
Well, no, except to say that obviously there is a need for a continuous discussion on these questions. The latest comments just explained, we are in the middle of a process which has to be, one has to look at the big picture on the one hand, and one has to look into fine details on the other hand. And this has to go on simultaneously and continuously. Now, I appreciate the importance of regulation of competition and anti-monopolistic policies that are fundamental for European Union approach to economy in general. And of course, it has a particularly significant importance for the question of regulation of the technical sector. Big tech companies, their taxation, their freedom of action, their monopolistic positions and all that. I mean, this is a whole area which we haven't addressed, which legitimately, speaking again about legitimacy, belong to civil society also. These are not only issues for business sector and for governments. These are questions for civil society as well. So my final thought would be simply, there is every reason to continue with this discussion, to kind of dissect it into more specific aspects, including the question of anti-monopolistic policies and regulation, together with everything else that was discussed today, and keep civil society aspect very much at the center in order to strengthen the basis of legitimacy for the future. See, there are always competing sources of legitimacy. Legitimacy is not a single or monolithic idea. Legitimacy is a complex matter which comes from different sources, including very strongly from civil society, which has not been at the center of legitimacy formation in the past 2 decades or so. It has been much stronger back in 1980s, which is the time which I remember very well. I mean, younger colleagues perhaps remember that less or not at all. But I know that there are moments when civil society can really drive the whole legitimacy discussion to new levels and define the framework in which then legislators and governments and businesses operate. So this is my final thought.
Thank you very much. I think as members of civil society, you've captured our heart with those comments, because that's actually absolutely what we strive for in our day-to-day work. And I'm sure I speak for Eliška Kristof as well. But over to you both if you want to have a few final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up the session. Maybe we start with Eliška. Please go ahead.
To be honest, I think that we covered so many diverse topics that there is not that much to add from my side. Just maybe that we are hoping that these upcoming years will bring us closer to that ideal situation when we have a regulation that actually put the user in the center. And we will definitely keep up our work. We already have our positioning on the future regulation. We continue in our advocacy work, and we will organize more and more outreach. And I'm hoping that we can meet here maybe in a year or two and be much smarter about the European Union vision of how platforms should be regulated, and also have more solid vision of what kind of internet and online space we want to exist in. Thank you so much for having me today. It was a great debate.
Thank you very much, Eliška. Krzysztof, over to you.
Yeah. So last words. Also, I have to say I agree so much with what President Turk has said in this remark. Also bringing in this context that sometimes the problem with the innovation versus the human rights or ethical issues are not to be concerning how the problem with innovation looks from the side of the monopolistic capitalism we have in regard to technology. But the last word from my side, also as a civil society, but also a person with some public official background, is to say that don't treat technology as something from the outer space or something that is not directly connected with our lives. I mean, this is the digital rights, our human rights, the place in the internet that we will find for ourselves, and we're working here and we're having an entertainment, etc. This is exactly the same space as offline. So the similar safeguards should be introduced, and this is of course the debate of the future, but I'm super happy it's having this peak now with all the things that European Commission also is doing. Keep up the job. We will submit our opinions on that, of course, so we'll still watching what politicians are doing in this regards to protect human rights and ethics.
Thank you very much. Yes, we will indeed. Very nice concluding remarks from all of you. And maybe to quote Marice, who had to left beforehand, I think it's a good day to celebrate democracy. And I think that's what we do with our daily jobs. And we put all the good energy that we can in doing that. So more from us very soon. Thank you to all of you for participating and sharing your expert thoughts. Thanks also for the audience for watching, and to the European Partnership on Democracy for organizing this and their partners. I wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you very soon. Take care.